Now on to the special days. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, these are my appointed feasts, the appointed feasts of the Lord, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies. There are 6 days when you may work, but the 7th day is a Sabbath of rest, a day of sacred assembly. You are not to do any work. Wherever you live, it is a Sabbath to the Lord." That's a regular every week occurrence. The rest of these are going to be like specific one time a year events. The Sabbath is an every week event. Every 7th day. Nations around Israel didn't have a Sabbath. So this is one of the things that distinguished Israel from their nations around them, was this idea of the Sabbath. It's one of the big reasons why God wanted them to observe the Sabbath, because it was one of the specific ways that they could be set apart from the rest of the nations around them. These are the Lord's appointed feasts, the sacred assemblies you are to proclaim at their appointed times. The Lord's Passover, which you read about back in Exodus. This is not the first time you've heard about this. The Lord's Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. On the 15th day, by the way, their months were based on the moon. Our months are based on the sun. But their months at this point in time were based on the moon. And their first month would have been equivalent roughly to around our month of March or so. They also had 2 calendars. They had a religious calendar and a civil calendar. Kind of confusing, isn't it? Well, see, that's one of the things that makes it difficult, because every nation in the world throughout history, or so many of these nations, had different kinds of calendars, different ways of keeping time. And as I just mentioned, some nations even had more than one calendar. They'd have a religious calendar and a civil calendar. And there's different ways of keeping track of the calendars. Israel's calendar was based on the moon. Our calendar is based on the sun. Egypt's calendar was based on the stars. Egypt's calendar was based on the dog star, we call it now Sirius in Greek or whatever, because their new year was in the middle of July. And our new year, of course, was January 1st. The Israelites' religious new year started in March sometime. So it's all different. And so trying to reconcile all this is tricky. Anyway, moving on. That's a little bit of a tangent from what I'm here to talk about today. So the Passover begins at twilight on the 14th day of the first month. We read about that back in Exodus. They cook. It's a commemoration of the Passover, where they put the blood on the doorposts, and they were ready. They had to eat with their cloaks on. They were ready to go whenever they were called at any time that night. On the 15th day of that month, so the next day, which would be a Sunday, the Lord's Feast of Unleavened Bread begins. Where am I? For 7 days, so that entire week, you must eat bread made without yeast. On the first day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. For 7 days, present an offering made to the Lord by fire. And on the 7th day, hold a sacred assembly and do no regular work. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak," so those would be right after each other. You'd have Passover and then the Feast of Unleavened Bread, one right after the other. The Lord said to Moses, of course, Jesus himself was crucified on the day of the Passover, the day before the Passover. They had the Passover meal. They had it on Thursday night, which we call Maundy Thursday, at least in my tradition. And then he was crucified on the Friday, and they had to break his legs. Well, they didn't break his legs. He was already dead. But the Jews wanted to get the bodies down from the crosses before sundown, because that's when Passover began. And they broke the legs of the 2 men on either side of him, but they didn't end up breaking Jesus' legs because he was already dead. Because they didn't want to leave the bodies up overnight, and they wanted them to be down before sundown, which is when the Passover began. So that was the day Jesus died. The Lord said, and then the day of unleavened bread, and I have read about the dates and the calendars and how it all shaped. The thing about these feasts is that all of them match up with specific, Christ fulfilled all, and sacrifices too, which you already mentioned. Like Christ fulfilled all of this in his ministry in different ways at different times in his ministry. The Passover, of course, is the most obvious because that's where he actually was arrested and had the Passover meal with the disciples in the upper room, and then was crucified on the day of the Friday before the Passover. It was taken down from the cross before sundown when Passover began that day, and because the Jews didn't want the bodies to be left up while Passover was happening. And so he is the Passover lamb, the one that was sacrificed so that our sins could be overlooked and forgiven. Not overlooked, but forgiven. And so we have that, that one is made very explicit, but all these feasts, as well as all the sacrifices, are fulfilled in the life and ministry of Christ in some way or another. The Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you enter the land I'm going to give you, and you reap its harvest, bring to the priest a sheaf of the first grain you harvest. He is to wave the sheaf." So there's that idea of like waving it towards the altar, presenting it to the altar, to the Lord on the altar. He is to wave the sheaf before the Lord, so it will be accepted on your behalf. The priest is to wave it on the day after the Sabbath. This would be Sunday. This would be the day after the Sabbath. On the day you wave the sheaf, you must sacrifice as a burnt offering to the Lord a lamb 1 year old without defect, together with its grain offering of 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour mixed with oil, an offering made to the Lord by fire, a pleasing aroma, and its drink offering of 1/4 of a hin of wine, or a hin, I might pronounce that. You must not eat any bread or roasted or new grain until the very day you bring this offering to your God. This is to be a lasting ordinance to the generations to come, wherever you live. Christ fulfilled this too, because he is the first fruits of the resurrection of the dead. The first fruit, the first one to be resurrected. The first fruits of the harvest that is to come. This was a prediction of the harvest. This was not actually, this was a prediction of the harvest that they were going to have to come. So these were like the first results of the planting season that year, which were the real harvest was to come later. Christ's resurrection was the first fruits of the harvest of resurrection to come. He was the first one to be raised, never to die again. Raised on this day after the Sabbath, so on the day of first fruits itself, and represents and foreshadows the resurrection to come of all those who believe in him. From the day after the Sabbath, the day you brought the sheaf of the wave of offering, so from the day of first fruits on, we call this the Feast of the First Fruits, although it wasn't specifically named that in that last section I just read. So from that day onward, count off 7 full weeks. Count off 50 days up to the day after the 7th Sabbath, and then present an offering of new grain to the Lord. We now call this Pentecost. That comes from the Greek word 50th. This is the 50th day after the day of first fruits. From wherever you live, bring 2 loaves made of 2/10 of an ephah of fine flour, baked with yeast, as a wave offering of first fruits to the Lord. Present with this bread 7 male lambs, each 1 year old and without defect, 1 young bull and 2 rams. They will be a burnt offering to the Lord, together with their grain offerings and drink offerings, an offering made by fire, an aroma pleasing to the Lord. It smells good in his nostrils. Then sacrifice 1 male goat for a sin offering, and 2 lambs, each 1 year old, for a fellowship offering. The priest is to weigh the 2 lambs before the Lord as a wave offering, together with the bread of the first fruits. They are a sacred offering to the Lord for the priest. On that same day you are to proclaim a sacred assembly and do no regular work. This is to be a lasting ordinance for the generations to come, wherever you live. This would again be Pentecost in the Greek. I mean, the Greek Pentecost itself is a Greek word, so this now represents Pentecost. Of course, that ends up being, and this represents. Well, let's go ahead and finish this section, shall we? When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Leave them for the poor and the alien. I am the Lord your God. So this is the rest of the harvest. Okay, so just like the first fruits was the very beginning, this is the rest of the harvest. This is celebrating the rest of the harvest. So Christ was raised in the day of first fruits as the first fruits of those who are to be resurrected to come. And then the harvest was on Pentecost when they first harvested the field of the people who were there into the temple area of that day in Jerusalem. So that represented the first harvest of the Christian era. Say, the Lord said to Moses, so here's another saying, say to the Israelites, on the first day of the 7th month, you are to have a day of rest. This would be around September sometime. A sacred assembly commemorated with trumpet blasts. Do no regular work, but present an offering made to the Lord by fire. That's the day of trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets. The Lord said to Moses, the 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Now, the Day of Atonement is laid out more in detail in the middle of the book of Leviticus. We'll get to that eventually. So, but this is the day it takes place. It's the 10th day of the 7th month. So you have a bunch of them together in a row, kind of at the beginning of the year, from March to May, basically. You have the Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which immediately follows that, the First Fruits, which kind of follows that. Then you have the Feast of Weeks, which is 57 weeks after that. Now you have a gap during the summer, and in the fall, the beginning of the 7th month, which would be around September or so, you have the Feast of Trumpets. Now this was their beginning of their civil new year. This is when they blew the trumpet and heralded the arrival of the civil new year in the fall. I don't know this for certain, obviously. Now, in the New Testament, I talked about how Christ fulfilled these other festivals. The Passover and the First Fruits and the Feast of Weeks are pretty clearly, explicitly fulfilled in the ministry of Christ in the New Testament, and the Pentecost, of course, being the day the church was formed. These next few are not so specifically linked to any specific event. I think we can link them, but it's much more tenuous. I believe the Feast of Trumpets is linked to the second coming of Christ. We do have this imagery in the New Testament of trumpets blasting upon Christ's return. So I believe, and I think there is a possibility that whenever Christ does come back, it will in fact be on the Day of Trumpets. Whatever day that falls on that year, I think there's a pretty good chance. If there's any one day of the year that I think it's safe to assume Christ is likely to return on, it'll be the Day of Trumpets whenever that falls any given year, or whatever year that happens to be. At any rate, now that's just my supposition. I can't prove that because that hasn't happened yet. At any rate, the return of Christ is associated with trumpets in the New Testament. So there is an idea of the Feast of Trumpets being fulfilled. Some people believe that Christ was actually born on the Feast of Trumpets as a baby. The Bible does not specify when he was born. Some people believe it was born. Now, I personally am more of the belief that he was born on another feast day later on, but some people believe that. I think it's more likely the Feast of Trumpets will be associated with the second coming of Christ rather than the first. At any rate, unlike these other previous festivals, which are very clearly linked to events that have already happened, these are a little bit more tenuous. So the Day of Atonement. The Lord said to Moses, the 10th day of this 7th month is the Day of Atonement. Hold a sacred assembly and deny yourselves, and present an offering made to the Lord by fire. We will read more about this day when we get to Leviticus 16 and 17, because the full instructions for this day are included there, not here. Do no work on that day, because it is a day of atonement, when atonement is made for you before the Lord your God. Anyone who does not deny himself on that day must be cut off from his people. I will destroy from among his people anyone who does any work on that day. You shall do no work at all. This is to be a lasting ordinance to the generations to come wherever you live. It is a Sabbath of rest for you, and you must deny yourselves. I don't know what exactly that means. It's ambiguous. It doesn't actually say what that means. One of the problems they're going to have is defining what exactly it means to do no work. What exactly does that mean? What exactly does it mean to deny yourself? From the evening of the 9th day until the month, from the evening of the 9th day of the month until the following evening, you are to observe your Sabbath. It is my general belief that Christ was probably baptized on the Day of Atonement. The Gospels do not specify this, but I think there is, if we're connecting these feast days to events in Christ's life and ministry, I believe that the Day of Atonement fits in somehow as Christ, either his baptism or his going out into the wilderness to be tempted by Satan. Because the Day of Atonement, as we'll read about when we get there, involved two separate sacrifices, one a normal blood sacrifice, and then one of a scapegoat that was cast out of the community. The priest, the high priest, would sacrifice one goat in the normal fashion, basically, and would take another goat and put his hands on it and would symbolically pass the sins of the community of Israel onto that goat, and then they would cast it out. Now, they'd probably go in later on and kill it too. But the symbolic act was they were the goat that symbolically carried the sins was being cast out. Jesus himself was crucified outside the city, and I believe that there might be a tie-in between his baptism and his going out to the wilderness to be tempted with the Day of Atonement. Again, that's not explicitly linked, but that is a possibility. The Lord said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month," so this is all in the 7th month here. We had the first day of the 7th month, the 10th day, now the 15th day. This, of course, would be a Sunday. 10, by the way. Okay, so the 15th day would be a Sunday because their months, their months were based on the moon. So every day, you started the month started with the new moon, and so every like our months now, like July this year started, what was that? On a Thursday. Okay, July could start any day of the week. Any month of the year could start any day of the week based on how our calendar falls. With a lunar calendar, your months always start with the new moon, so the new moon will always be the first day of the week. That day would always be the first day of the week. So your months would always start on the first day of the week. So the 15th day of the month would always be a Sunday. The 14th day of the month would always be a Saturday because your months always start on the first day of the week because you're basing it on, the month starts with the new moon, and so whenever that happens, that'd be the first day of the week. So the 15th day of the week would therefore always be a Sunday. Say to the Israelites, on the 15th day of the 7th month, the Lord's Feast of Tabernacles begins, and it lasts for 7 days. This is a week-long event. The first day is a sacred assembly. Do no regular work. For 7 days, present offerings made to the Lord by fire. And on the 8th day, hold a sacred assembly and present an offering made to the Lord by fire. It is the closing assembly. That would be the following Sunday. So it starts on a Sunday and ends the following Sunday. It is the closing assembly. Do no regular works. These are kind of like special Sabbath days too, because they're supposed to follow the Sabbath rules during these days, even though these are not Sabbath days. This is the first day of the week, not the last day of the week, but they're supposed to follow the Sabbath rules because it's a sacred day. It's a sacred holy day. These are the Lord's appointed feasts, which you are to proclaim as sacred assemblies for bringing offerings made to the Lord by fire. The burnt offerings and grain offerings, sacrifices and drink offerings required for each day. These offerings are in addition to those, the Lord's Sabbaths. So you have that every 7th day of the week, all throughout the year. And in addition to your great gifts and whatever you have vowed and all the free will offerings you give to the Lord. So beginning with the 15th day of the 7th month, after you have gathered the crops of the land, celebrate the festival to the Lord for 7 days. The first day is a day of rest, begin a Sunday, and the 8th day also is a day of rest. On the first day, you are to take choice fruit from the trees, and palm fronds, leafy branches, and poplars, and rejoice before the Lord your God for 7 days. So they were commanded to rejoice here. This is not a day of denial or fasting, this is a day of rejoicing. Celebrate this as a festival to the Lord for 7 days each year. This is to be a lasting ordinance to the generations to come. Celebrate it in the 7th month. Live in booths for 7 days. All native-born Israelites are to live in booths. This is also sometimes called the Feast of Booths, so that your descendants will know that I had the Israelites live in booths when I brought them out of Egypt. I am the Lord your God. So Moses announced to the Israelites the appointed feasts of the Lord. Booths, or tent. Sometimes you have the word tent. These are little temporary shelters, huts, tents. Not sure exactly. I think the Jewish word is succoth or something. I don't know how you pronounce it. I really don't. And basically, when they are moving around, in the narrative where we are, they're still not moving. They're still at Sinai. But when they do start moving around, they're not going to have permanent residences because they're not in their land yet. So they're going to be living in these temporary shelters that they construct here and there. You can call them tents. It's almost often thought of as tents. And that's what a tabernacle. The tabernacle itself was a tent. So they're called the Feast of Tabernacles, sometimes called the Feast of Booths, and it's basically just a reminder, of course, that when they were left Egypt and wandering around, they were living in booths the whole time, or tents, or temporary residences that were not meant for permanent habitation. It was a reminder to them. My personal belief is that Christ was probably born on the Feast of Tabernacles. Because the idea of tabernacle itself connotes the idea of God taking up residence among us. John, in the beginning of John's Gospel of John, uses the word tabernacle, or he pitched his tents among us, to describe the Word being made flesh and coming to dwell with man. Even though that's as close as the Gospels come to linking Christ's birth with the tabernacles. But if all these feasts fit into Christ's ministry in some way or another, some of them we have very, very directly linked. The Passover, the first fruits, we have very directly linked to events in Christ's ministry. Pentecost became the beginning day of the church. It stands to reason that the rest of the festivals would also represent or key in with certain major events in Christ's life and ministry, even though they're not as explicitly connected to anything Christ did or in his life per se, like a specific event. Like I said, I think the Feast of Trumpets probably will herald the return or be connected with, or because the idea of blowing trumpet blast to announce a return is in the New Testament. I think probably Christ was probably born on the Feast of Tabernacles one year, whatever year that would have been. Someday in the fall of whatever year in late BCs, like right before 1 AD or 1 BC or 2 BC or somewhere in there. It's probably when Christ was that's my supposition, that's my speculation, that when Christ was born. By the way, I was going to mention something. I hadn't tipped my tongue. I started talking about it, but I kind of left off. When I talked about the lunar calendar, like every month would have begun with the new moon. That would have been the first day of the week. So every 15th day of every month would have been a Sunday, because every month would have begun with the first day of the week being on the new moon, which is that's when the month began. So like unlike our calendar, where the 15th day could be any day, just depending on how the weeks fall. In their calendar, the 15th day was always going to be a Sunday. Okay, so these sevens and tens and all that, they're seven. These aren't arbitrarily chosen numbers. Okay, so Passover itself represents the beginning of their nation. It happened on the first day of the first month of the year, I think because that represented the beginning of their nation. That was the day they essentially became a nation, when they fled Egypt. That night they fled Egypt. And then, of course, the next several festivals kind of all follow in the wake of Passover from then until Pentecost, the Feast of Weeks. Then in the fall, they have another set of festivals that were in the seventh month. And the seventh is the number of perfection. It's the number of God. We've had the number 7 identified with perfection ever since Genesis 1, when he rested on the seventh day and made it holy. And from that point onward, all the way to the very end, we're going to have just a constant association of the number 7 with the number of perfection or holiness. And Revelation, the end of the Bible, is going to have all kinds of 7s. There's going to be 7 of everything in Revelation. So 7 is the number of perfection or holiness. 10 is a number of completeness, because you have 10 fingers. That's a human standard. Okay, that's like a human idea of completeness, but God uses that. 7, I think, is God's ideal number. Again, like I said, that's rooted in the 7th-day creation. Declaring the 7th day holy, like that. I think 10 is more of a man-made number of completion, because we have 10 fingers on our hands. So the 10th day being the day of the ceremony makes sense, because that's a complete number of days. That's 10 days. And So that's where some of these significant. I don't think there's anything particularly significant about the 15th day, in any more than that. This is a festival that begins on the second on the hang on. Let me it begins. It all happens in the 7th month, and you start with the Feast of Trumpets. That's the first day of the 7th month. Then you have the Day of Atonement, which is the 10th day. So that'd be in the 2nd week, and then the 15th day would be a Sunday, the day after the 2nd Sabbath of the month. I don't think 15 in particular represents a particular significance as much as it's the next day. It's the first day after the Sabbath, after the Day of Atonement, which is on the 10th day. And of course, these festivals last for 7 days, and they end on the 8th day, which would be the following Sunday. And so there is some significance to some of these numbers. And 7 is the number of perfection. 8 in this sense is the number. Some of these festivals go a week and then finish on the 8th day. Even in the timeline of Christ's resurrection, it's like the Holy Week, like the Passion Week when he entered Jerusalem on the Sunday. He was raised the next Sunday. So even there, you have the idea of Christ being raised on the 8th day from when he entered the week, or the idea of him being raised in the beginning of the new week. Just the idea of this is the week after the first week or whatever. So there, and then of course 10, being the number of completion, tied in with the number of fingers on a person's hands. So there is significance to some of these numbers. They're not arbitrarily chosen. Then you have 7 sevens. You have 7 weeks. 7 periods of 7 weeks. You count until you get to the ending festival of the spring, which would be the Feast of Weeks, or the Pentecost, as we call it today. That'd be the last festival of the spring. Now, we're not bound by any of these feast days today. We're not bound by any of these laws or these feast days today. It is useful to know them. It's useful to know what they meant. It's useful to know what how they factored into the Israelite worship system. And it is useful to know how they were fulfilled in the life and ministry of Christ and what they mean for us today. But we do not have to fulfill these today. We do not have to follow these today. We don't have to go out and live in booths for a week today in September. Build a little shelter or a hut outside my house or a tent and live in that for a week. Don't have to do that today, thankfully. But it is helpful to know about this stuff and keep in mind what it means to the ministry, because Jesus would have done all this. Okay, like this is stuff that Jesus and his apostles would have done, and the early Christians would have done. They not only knew about it, they did it. They had spent their early lives before they became Christians. Later on in their lives, they would have actually done this stuff. So it is important to know that in that sense, but it is important to remember that we don't have to follow these today, and that we don't have to arrange our year around these events today. We don't have to arrange our calendar year or our church year around these festivals today. I come from a tradition where we have a church year. I talked before about how Israel had 2 calendars, the civil calendar and the religious calendar. Zion, where I spent my formative youth, has a church year, follows a church calendar. So we have a civil calendar. And Zion and other, the Lutheran denomination in general, and other traditional Protestant denominations follow a church year, a church calendar. And I said way back at the beginning of this session, these videos, before I even got started reading the text, actually, way back when I first started this, that our traditions don't necessarily have to be bad, but they can become bad. And I think that following the church year isn't necessarily bad, but we're not commanded to do it. The New Testament does not tell us to. In fact, Paul even tells us basically in Colossians not to. He goes on about them following, sacred days and feasts and stuff. Like, we don't have to do it. There is a certain logic in doing it because it helps us structure our worship services. And as we read in 2 Corinthians, at the end, 2 Corinthians 14, like there is I'm so confused. 1 Corinthians 14. There are prohibitions against letting your worship services get out of hand. When you get together as a congregation, you're supposed to keep order in the service. And if following the church year is one way that you choose to do that, it might have some value. Just like arranging your year by the theme of the year at my current church might have some value, but you have to be careful that your tradition, because the Bible, the New Testament, Paul, Peter, none of them ever command that we follow a church year. None of them ever command that we have a theme of the year every year. And in fact, we're explicitly told, basically, not to continue following these Jewish festivals and feast days. So it is important to know this stuff, I think. I think it's very beneficial and helps us broaden our understanding of Christianity, especially the beginning of it, because Jesus and his disciples did do this stuff. But I think it's also important not to make it too important, not to go back to following these rules and these laws and these commands, which the writer of Hebrews specifically says don't do, or to pattern our own ears off of them. I think because that's basically what the church year is. The church year is a way to pattern the worship services that we hold today after the Jewish pattern of the Old Testament. That's essentially what that is. And I think that is taking it a step farther than it should be taken. Okay.